What if we told you that a football match and bananas started a war that took the lives of 3,000 people? The 100-hour war between Honduras and El Salvador began days after the third football match during the FIFA 1970 World Cup qualifier. But that was just the matchstick. The powder keg was being filled by dictatorships in El Salvador and Honduras for decades prior. Years of violence, injustice, and abuse blew up into an all-out war after Honduras lost the qualifier. Welcome to Uncharted History. Join us as we uncover the unjust football war started by two wealthy elites and veiled under the guise of violent football fans. The war began with bananas, specifically Chiquita bananas. You see, Chiquita Brands International was formerly known as the United Fruit Company. This American conglomerate owned vast plantations of bananas in Honduras. At one point, the corporation grew so large that it owned 10% of Honduran farmland, making it nearly impossible for small farmers to compete. To make matters worse, in 1966, the United Fruit Company and other large businesses banded together and formed FINAG, which translated to the National Federation of Farmers and Livestock Farmers of Honduras. These fat cat landowners and agrarian elites decided to further hedge their wealth by forcing Honduran President Oswaldo López Arellano to enact anti-Salvadoran and anti-peasantry laws, specifically targeting the campesino. The campesino is a tenant farmer who works the land of wealthy owners. One party provides the land, while the other provides the labor. A relatively fair and just system until Honduras forcefully enacted the land reform in 1967. You see, because Honduras had 5 times the land of El Salvador, many Salvadorans went to Honduras to work on the plantations. At one point, around 300,000 Salvadorans had settled in Honduras, representing more than 10% of the country's 2.6 million population. Thanks to the land reform law, the central government took the land from both immigrant farmers and squatters, disregarding their ownership or immigration status. This caused uproar among the Salvadoran and Honduran laborers who were married to Salvadorans. Eventually, the land reform led to mass expulsions as hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans were stripped of their land and forced to leave Honduras by 1969. As luck would have it, during this troublesome period, the 1970 FIFA World Cup qualifier was taking place. For the first time in history, Honduras and El Salvador met at a FIFA tournament played in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, on June 8, 1969. Honduras won the match on home turf, and Salvadoran fans were outraged. Riots broke out the same day, but the fighting quickly stopped. On June 15, 1969, a second match between El Salvador and Honduras was organized in San Salvador, where the Salvadoran team won 3-0. To humiliate Hondurans even further, instead of flying their national flag, the Salvadorans flew a dirty rag. Honduran players and fans were terrified. "We were lucky that we lost," said Enrique Cardona, a player for Honduras' national team. "Otherwise, we wouldn't be alive today." However, when Honduran fans returned home and recounted what happened, nationalist organizations began attacking and burning the homes of Salvadoran citizens in Honduras. On top of the government-organized expulsions, more Salvadorans returned to El Salvador, fearing for their safety. In the 10 days that followed, 11,700 Salvadorans fled the country. As a response, on June 26th, the Salvadoran government severed all diplomatic relations with Honduras, stating that, in this Republic of Honduras, there is still homicide, humiliation, violation of women, dispossession, persecution, and mass expulsion that have targeted thousands of Salvadorans due simply to their nationality, in events that have no precedence in Central America nor in America as a whole. One day later, on June 27, 1969, a playoff match took place in Mexico City on neutral territory. The game was tied, but after the extra time, El Salvador won 3-2. Fans began rioting. Outrage and pandemonium flooded the streets. The fans weren't angry at the football match. The outrage was a byproduct of public unrest brewing for decades. El Salvador's victory was the matchstick that lit the powder keg of strained relations between Honduras and El Salvador. The drums of war were raging, and the 4-day football war was about to begin. Despite being smaller in landmass, El Salvador had a population of 3.7 million, which was 40% larger than that of Honduras at 2.6 million. Because El Salvador had a stronger army, they could lead an attack on Honduras. The country had 7 infantry battalions with 81mm mortars ready for war. On top of the infantry, they also had 1 commando company, 1 special forces company, 1 motorized squadron, and 2 artillery battalions equipped with M101 100mm and NM116 75mm howitzers. Finally, 2 battalions of the National Guard backed up the civil militia, around 6,000 personnel. On top of that, the Salvadoran Air Force, the FAS, was preparing for war. A fleet of civilian Cessna's aircraft was transformed into makeshift bombers. Engineers removed the passenger side doors and rigged special seat straps, turning these ordinary aircraft into bombers. The pilots flew with football-sized mortar rounds seated next to them. By removing the special straps and tilting the plane, they could throw these shells into the sky. Besides their superior army, El Salvador had an unbelievably powerful ally on their side. The Central American nation hired Archie Baldocky, an American plane restorer who married a Salvadoran woman and fell in love with her homeland. He took one of his P-51 Mustangs, retooled it, and donated it to the war effort. He also hired a few American fighter pilots, promising to pay them $2,500 for each Honduran aircraft they destroyed in battle. El Salvador certainly had a formidable army for such a small country, but what about on the other side of the border? The Honduran army was frail. They had 6 infantry battalions, but because of the rampant corruption, only 1 was ready for war. The single artillery division was equipped with an M20 75mm recoilless rifle and 81mm mortars, but they didn't have a single tank or armored vehicle. While the Honduran army was having trouble rallying their forces, El Salvador was already planning their attack strategy. In the north, 2 infantry battalions, a commando company, and a battalion of the National Guard were tasked with seizing the city of Santa Rosa de Copan. However, the main attack would be carried through the northeastern theater, where 4 infantry battalions, the Special Forces Company, and all of their artillery would advance towards the city of Nacaome, seizing the high ground for an attack and drawing closer to Tegucigalpa, the Honduran capital. On July 14, 1969, the P-51 Mustangs, the Cessnas, and the Pipers were ready for war. Their strategy, inspired by the Israeli Six-Day War of 1967, was to cripple the Honduran Air Force with a couple of strategic attacks. 31 planes in total, including 5 Corsair FG-1Ds and 4 Mustang II bombers, attacked the Honduran ground forces at sunset around 5:50 p.m. and returned home safe and sound under the veil of night. On July 14th, their first strategic target was the Toncontín International Airport, which disabled the more powerful Honduran Air Force, leaving them incapable of reacting. This attack brought El Salvador 2 additional days, leaving them free to launch a major offensive down the Pan-American Highway, the most important highway connecting the 2 nations. Thanks to this attack, El Salvador made rapid progress on the Eastern Front and came within striking distance of Tegucigalpa. Fortunately for Honduras, what they lacked in ground forces, they more than made up for in Air Force superiority. On July 15th, Honduran C-47 planes bombed El Salvador, with F-4 Corsairs destroying the fuel storage tanks located near the port of Cutuco. On July 16th, the Salvadoran Eastern Front kept pushing back Honduran defending armies, while both air forces reinforced the ground troops. Unfortunately, the following day, the tides of war shifted. The Honduran Air Force dealt a crippling blow to the FAS, killing 3 of their fighters in air combat, and El Salvador shot down one of their own fighters in friendly fire. To make matters worse, El Salvador's American mercenary pilots refused to fly against the more formidable Honduran Air Force. But regardless of their efforts on the battlefield, the Organization of American States, the OAS, put an end to the war on July 18, 1969. While Honduras and El Salvador waged war, the U.S. was preoccupied with the war in Vietnam and the Apollo 11 moon landing. Fearing that El Salvador would invade Tegucigalpa, the Honduran government called for the intervention of the OAS. After organizing an urgent meeting on July 18th, a ceasefire took place later that same day. The fighting stopped after 4 days, hence the 100-hour war. Despite the end of the war, the ceasefire was not in full effect until July 20th. In the end, Honduras suffered 2,100 casualties, most of which were civilians, while El Salvador lost 900 soldiers and civilians, along with 3 aircraft. Despite pressures from the OAS, El Salvador refused to recall their troops until August 2nd. That day, the OAS threatened rigorous sanctions against El Salvador. The war ended after just 4 days, but the peace accord wouldn't be signed for the next 10 years. The crazy football war was summarized perfectly by Cristian Vialta, the editor of El Gráfico, a popular newspaper from El Salvador, saying, "This was 2 military dictatorships using the games to exacerbate nationalism." Calling it the soccer war, he adds, is like saying World War II broke out because of the artistic failure of Adolf Hitler in Vienna. It's nonsense. This is Uncharted History. See you in our next video.